In this session, we'll learn three things about neurons. How are neurons connected to each other? How is the electric impulse or the nerve impulse transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron, or from the neuron to an effector cell? The effector cell is usually a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And the third thing that we'll understand in this particular session is what is a neuromuscular junction. Now, in order to start, let us start the session by observing this particular image here. And what we see here, we see two neurons that are lying adjacent to each other. It seems like that they are connected here, which technically they are not, and yet they are connected. And this is what we are going to understand. But in order to understand that, let us understand a couple of other things. Now, the first thing that we must all understand is that neurons are excitable cells. Now, all the neurons are excitable cells here, the excitable cells. What do we mean by excitable cell? Any cell which when receives a sufficiently strong stimulus, it can be a pressure stimulus, it can be an electric impulse, it can be a chemical stimulus. When a cell, any particular cell that receives sufficiently strong stimulus ends up generating an electric disturbance, such a cell that does it is called an excitable cell. So neurons are excitable cells. Similarly, muscle fibers or muscle cells are also excitable cells. This means if you stimulate a nerve cell sufficiently strongly, it will generate an electric disturbance, and that electric disturbance will travel from the dendritic ends across the cell body or the soma, across the surface of the axon to the axon terminals, and eventually those electric disturbances, which is also called the nerve impulse, reaches the ends, and these ends are called synaptic knobs. And let me just circle one of those knobs. So this is a synaptic knob, and there are lots of them. Synaptic knob is sometimes also referred to as the synaptic button. So this is how a synaptic knob looks, and here exactly what we have is a synaptic knob. Now, what we can see in this particular image here is that the synaptic knob, which is basically the end of the axon, is not in direct contact with the membrane of the next neuron. So this neuron, the dendrites of the neuron are lying extremely close to the surface of the axon terminal, to the synaptic knob, but they are not physically in contact with each other. There is a gap between the two. So they are never, the two neurons are never in physical contact with each other, the two adjacent neurons. Rather, there is a gap between the two. Now, this whole structure, the synaptic knob, the gap, and the membrane of the adjacent neuron, which is lying extremely close to the synaptic knob, these three structures together make up something called the synapse, synapse. So this whole structure here is called the synapse, and this gap in the middle is called a synaptic cleft. This gap here is called the synaptic cleft. Cleft means a gap. Now, the neuron that lies behind the synaptic cleft. So this is the cleft, and the neuron that lies behind. So the cleft is somewhere here, right there. This is the place where we have the synaptic cleft. So the neuron that lies behind the synapse is called a presynaptic cell. Pre means before. So the term simply means the cell that lies before the synapse, a presynaptic cell. So this particular neuron is called a presynaptic cell. And the cell that lies ahead of, or after the synapse. So this neuron lies after the synapse, after this gap, right? So this whole neuron is called a postsynaptic cell. The word post means after. So the cell that lies after the synapse is the postsynaptic cell. Similarly, there is two more terms that we must understand. The membrane, this particular membrane of the knob, of the synaptic knob, is called the presynaptic membrane, right? Because this membrane lies before the gap. So this membrane is called the presynaptic synaptic membrane. So we can call it the presynaptic membrane, this membrane here, right? And the membrane of the dendrite, this whole thing here, the membrane of the dendrite or the membrane that lies ahead of the cleft is called the postsynaptic membrane. Postsynaptic membrane. Now, so much for the diagram. Let's proceed further. Now, here in this particular diagram, we'll try to understand, in spite of the presence of a gap between the two neurons, how does the disturbance or the nerve impulse travel from one neuron? How does the electric impulse travels from this neuron and jumps across this gap to the other neuron? How does that happen? So let us try to understand the mechanism. Now, in order to do that, let us first of all assume that a nerve impulse has already been generated. Let's say a nerve impulse is traveling through the presynaptic cell. So this cell here represents the presynaptic cell. So this is the presynaptic cell, and this is the axon terminal, right? This structure here is the axon terminal. Now, the axon terminal ends in a synaptic knob, and this is the synaptic knob that we have here. So let us draw. Let us say that this is the electric impulse that is coming, and these are the single electric impulse that is traveling towards. Once the electric impulse reaches the knob, a certain kind of a chemical change takes place. And what is that chemical change? That chemical change is that the calcium ions which are found in the surroundings. So there are these calcium ions found in the surroundings of the knob. They are absorbed by the synaptic knob. So because of this electric disturbance, calcium ions start to move inwards from the surrounding into the synaptic knob. And these calcium ions, what they do is that they stimulate these vesicles. Now there are these vesicle-like structures which contain specific kind of molecules inside them, and these vesicles are called synaptic vesicles. These are called synaptic vesicles. Now these synaptic vesicles are activated by the presence of calcium ions, and these vesicles then what they do, under the effect of calcium ions, they start to move towards the membrane close to the synaptic cleft. So they move here, and then these vesicles, they fuse. You can see that they have fused with the presynaptic membrane facing the synaptic cleft, and in turn they release the molecules that they contain into this gap. Now these molecules that are released into the gap are called neurotransmitter molecules. An example of a neurotransmitter molecule is acetylcholine. Now what this neurotransmitter does is, the moment this neurotransmitter is released, this neurotransmitter moves into the cleft and then reaches the postsynaptic membrane. And once it reaches the postsynaptic membrane, it attaches to special receptors present there. And once it attaches to the special receptors, it changes the chemistry of the membrane, of the postsynaptic membrane. The chemistry of the postsynaptic membrane is changed, and the postsynaptic membrane then starts to take in sodium ions from the surrounding into it. Now, more the number of acetylcholine esterase, the stronger is the uptake of sodium ions from the surrounding. And when sufficient amount of sodium ions are accumulated inside this dendrite, this postsynaptic membrane on the inside, an electric impulse is generated, which then travels from the dendrite to the cell body, eventually to the axon and axon terminal of this particular neuron. And this process continues on and on. Now, another important thing is, now if there are so many acetylcholine molecules attached to this particular membrane, the postsynaptic membrane, the sodium ions can keep just getting in, and a continuous electric impulse will keep on generating, will keep on propagating through this postsynaptic cell. In order to prevent that, to prevent the continuous generation of electric disturbances within the postsynaptic cell, the postsynaptic cell, this particular cell, also generates a molecule called an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. And where is this enzyme released? This enzyme is released into this particular gap, where these acetylcholine molecules are then broken down into certain simpler components which are absorbed back by the knob, by the synaptic knob of the presynaptic cell. So I hope you've understood how an electric impulse is transmitted from one neuron to the other. And let us very rapidly revise. The electric impulse reaches the axon terminal into the synaptic knob. The synaptic knob, due to this electric impulse, this electric disturbance, starts absorbing calcium ions that are present in the surroundings of the synaptic knob. These calcium ions will then stimulate these vesicles called the synaptic vesicles, which contain molecules called neurotransmitters. These ions stimulate these vesicles containing neurotransmitters to move towards the presynaptic membrane facing the synaptic cleft, where after the fusion the neurotransmitter is released. The neurotransmitter, an example being acetylcholine, when it is released into the synaptic cleft, it attaches to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane or the membrane of the dendrite, or it can also be a muscle cell, right? It attaches there. The attachment of the neurotransmitters on the postsynaptic membrane changes the chemistry of the membrane of the postsynaptic membrane. The postsynaptic cell then takes up sodium ions. These sodium ions, when there is a sufficient buildup, it is not that only one or two ions, when they are absorbed, an electric disturbance is generated. When sufficient amount of sodium ions are absorbed, an electric impulse is generated in the dendrite, and that also moves across the dendrite to the cell body, eventually to the axon terminal, the axon knob. And when it reaches the synaptic knob, at its synaptic knob, the same processes take place. Now, in order to break the continuous generation of an electric signal by the postsynaptic cell, the postsynaptic cell generates an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase, which breaks down this acetylcholine into simpler compounds, which are taken back by the presynaptic cell. Those components are again combined together and packed into synaptic vesicles. Now, this combining of these simpler molecules, acetyl-CoA, etc., they require energy. They require a lot of ATP. And what produces that ATP? The mitochondria present in the synaptic knob. And so synaptic knobs are rich in synaptic vesicles and a lot of mitochondria. So here, this is all about how a nerve impulse is transmitted across a synapse. Let us now try to understand the conduction of messages between a neuron and a muscle cell. Now, a muscle cell is a kind of an effector cell. Now, as we have already discussed, I've already spoken that the muscle cell is also an excitable cell, which means if it is stimulated sufficiently, it will also generate its own electric impulse and it contracts. And when the electric impulse dies, it relaxes. So that is how the muscles contract and relax. They act like biological motors, and that's why they are able to move our bodies. Anyways, so the neurons, you can see this is a motor neuron, and the function of the motor neuron is to bring the appropriate signal or information in the form of electric impulse or nerve impulse, and carry that signal and transmit that signal to the effector organ. Now, effector organ is usually a muscle cell. Now, the mechanism is the same. The axon of the motor neuron comes in extremely close proximity with the muscle fiber. Now you see it's in close proximity. You can see the synaptic cleft here. The presynaptic membrane is of the neuron. The presynaptic cell is the neuron itself. The postsynaptic membrane belongs to the muscle fiber, and the postsynaptic cell is the muscle fiber itself. And there is a gap. And how is this information, the information that the motor neuron is bringing from the central nervous system. The motor neuron brings the information from the central nervous system. We've seen it on our in some of our earlier sessions. So the signal, that is the message that is coming from the central nervous system, is brought by the motor neuron. The motor neuron eventually has to deliver that signal, and the signal is then stopped. Basically, it reaches the synaptic knob, and the same biochemical process takes place. The uptake of calcium ions, stimulating the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the with the presynaptic membrane, the bursting of the vesicles, the release of acetylcholine or some other kind of a neurotransmitter, the picking up of those neurotransmitter by the receptors on the post-synaptic membrane, the uptake of sodium ions, and the excitation of the muscle cell, the contraction and the relaxation. So I hope in this particular session you were able to understand these three objects: the how the neurons are connected to each other, are they connected physically or not, the mechanism of nerve impulse transmission across the neuron, so, and also what a neuromuscular junction is, and how a neuron communicates its messages, or it transmits its nerve impulse to the muscles. Just one last closing comment is that the inside or on the surface of the neuron, the information travels in the form of an electric signal, and the same signal travels across the synaptic cleft in the form of a chemical message. So in the nervous system, the information travels primarily as an electric, but also equally importantly, it travels also as a chemical signal. So I hope you've understood the mechanism and the session is clear. Thank you.